Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the another session on Information System Audit course. This particular presentation is going to deal with the module 5, where we are going to talk about the protection of information assets. This is the third video in this module series, which deals with the protection of information assets. And earlier in the modules, I have spoken about the various important aspects which I would like to cover as far as audit module 5 is concerned. I've already completed Wi-Fi security video on Wi-Fi security. And I've already completed another video on firewall types and implementation. And today I'm going to talk about the third important aspects and the important concepts that deals with the protection of information assets, and that is the logical access control. So without wasting much of a time, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all who are appreciating my videos and my efforts. And I hope that these videos are certainly going to make a lot of difference in your studies. And in the forthcoming exams of ESI, you will surely be able to perform very well, right? So that's all I have to say to you guys. And needless to say that I'll keep on adding on more videos as soon as possible. So reviewing the important concepts are related to the logical access control. If you look into the broader structure of this module 5, it talks about the protection of information assets. Now, when you're talking about the information assets, you're talking about the digital assets. Now, we know that the digital assets are basically in the form of an intangible asset. So they require a lot of protection in terms of access, which can be in the form of a physical access. But more importantly is that these digital or the information assets require logical access controls to be implemented. Now, controls are the processes and the procedures which are built into the system itself, that handles the information assets or which host the information assets, right? So logical access control is an important aspect. So as I mentioned earlier, if you talk about the access control, access means how do I have an access, or how do I, get in touch with those assets which are there in the form of information or digital assets. So some with the organizations and the information systems, what you call it as an administrator or a data owner, has the responsibility of restricting the control to these type of information assets. So access controls which are implemented in the information systems can be of two types: the physical access control and the logical access control. Now, physical access control talks about, or rather limits the access to the building room and the physical infrastructure which relates to the hosting of information assets or the digital assets. Whereas the logical access control limits the connectivity, especially in talks of computer networks, system files, and the data. So one is physical, that is tangible, that is accessibility to the building, to the computer section, to the computer room, server rooms, things like that. Whereas the logical access control talks about that how do you restrict, or how do you limit, or how do you define the access or the uh, uh, you know permissions that you give to the people for accessing the nodes, the host, the servers, the computer networks, the gateways, the system files, the application files, and so on and so forth. So logical access controls are nothing but these are tools and the protocols. Now, protocols are, these are standard operating procedures, right? It's a definite. Like, say, for instance, you might have heard that when a PM visits to another country, there is a standard security protocol that is to be followed. That means there is defined rules and regulations which have to be followed in terms of the security before a prime minister could, visit a country. The same way, if you look into what logical access controls, how you define it, these are basically tools, or in other ways, they are the protocols which are used primarily for identification, that is, who is going to access particular information; authentication, that is, how do I verify that the person who's claiming to be that person is the person; authorization, whether the person is authorized or has the approval to access such information assets or the digital assets; and lastly, the accountability, that why and what is the responsibility, or what is the role of that particular person who is accessing this information in the organization, right? So if you look into it, there are four important aspects of logical access control. That is identifying the credential of the person who is trying to access the information assets, authenticating and verifying the identity of the person who is trying to access the information assets or the digital assets. Then also ensuring that the person who is trying to access these information asset has the necessary approval or is authorized, and his job role is such that he is responsible, that he is accountable for that maintenance or for accessing of such information assets. So categories of access control, it's defined into four categories. That is mandatory access control, discretionary access control, role-based access control, and rule-based access control. Now, these controls, as I said, these are nothing but the tools and the protocols. Now, how do I define a protocol? Because when you are accessing a particular system, then there are certain steps or the certain software restrictions that are implemented by the application programmer or the system programmer, so that your access has to be identified, verified, authorized, and then accordingly you are being given the permission to access the information asset. So let's talk about one by one. When we talk about mandatory access control, it's also known as MACs. This cannot be controlled or modified by the normal user or the data owners. I use the word data owners, right? Who is the person who is responsible for maintaining the data, who is responsible for, ensuring that the data is updated and maintained. They're called as data owners, right? It's very essential that before we talk about the implementing of controls as far as information assets are concerned, it is very essential that we logically classify these information assets, right? So once their classification of information assets is done, it clearly tells who is the data owner of that particular information assets. This helps in defining the responsibility and accordingly, right? So mandatory access control means these are compulsory and they cannot be modified or controlled by the normal user. System administrator can do that, or a person at a higher level can do that, but you as a normal user, me and you cannot do anything about it, and we do not have any right or control or privileges of modifying these controls. The second one is the discretionary access control, they're known as DACs. These can be activated or modified by the data owners at their discretion, right? So now the point is, discretionary access control is that I, as a data owner and a user of a particular area of a information system, have the discretion, have the will. At my will, I can restrict some people, or I cannot restrict. I forget about that, restricting certain people, right? So discretionary means it's up to the data owners and their sweet will how they decide what type of controls are to be implemented, what access controls have to be implemented as far as the logical access is concerned, and what are not. From the examination point of view, it is always asked that which control is the better. So if you're talking about the logical access control and the categories of the logical access control, then in that case, mandatory access controls are better in terms of data security as compared to the discretionary access control. Simple reason you must have noticed, because mandatory access controls are governed at a higher level, and they have the restriction that ordinary user cannot manipulate, modify, or control them. Similarly, the third category is the role-based access control. Now, role-based means this clearly defines that's the importance of job description and the job role. Now, if your job role or a job description describes, necessitates that you must access a particular level of information asset, then these logical access control will allow you to have an access to that particular level of information assets. Now, these restricts network access based on person's role within the organization. Like, say, you must have seen that if you're working if you're in a bank and you wanted to have if you're looking after the savings account. So let's say, for instance, you are only authorized to handle the operations as far as savings accounts are concerned. You cannot go to the deposits account, or you cannot go into the current account, which means that depending upon the type of role you have defined role in the organization hierarchy, your access to the information assets will be defined accordingly. Otherwise, you will not be allowed to access the other areas of the information assets. Employees are not allowed to access the information necessary uh, uh, their employees are not allowed to access unnecessary information which has got nothing to do with the job roles, right? So if your job requires access to a particular level of information, definitely these role-based access control will play an important role, and they allow you to do so. Otherwise, they will not allow you to do so. Now, rule-based access control, these restrict access to the areas, devices, or databases according to the predetermined set of rules or access permissions, regardless of the role or position in an organization. Now, see, the one aspect is that your job description defines, or your job description demands, that you need to access to a particular level of information. Whereas at the organization level, there are certain security standards which is decided by the top level management, or even the board of directors, as a matter of fact, or the system administrator, or the chief information officer, or chief technology officer. These people, in coordination with the top level management, defines that there are certain rules which will be followed, and based on those rules which are defined in the charter, audit charter, or maybe the job charter, these data, access to information assets is restricted, and this is defined by, these rules are defined by the government, governing organization itself, right? Now, logical access, if you are trying to implement, then in that case, there are certain necessary steps involved in implementing the logical access control, as I have mentioned earlier. Now I'll repeating those things. First is inventory of information system resources. That is, what type of assets your organization is having. There has to be an inventory of the information assets, right? This is the first most important. And I have noticed that there are many questions have been asked. I repeat once again, all the things which you are seeing in these slides, or the handouts, or important concepts that we are discussing, these are not mine. These are basically taken up from the examination papers, and they are framed in such a way that they become a concept for your reviewing purpose. So even a small word written on each and every slide is important from the examination point of view. I hope it is clear. So when I say steps in implementing logical access control, you will find that the first important step is have an inventory of the information assets. What information assets are there within the organization? You need to have an inventory of it. Second is classify the information assets. That is, whatever information resources, or information assets, or information systems you have, you need to have a proper classification, because this classification will help in defining the will be matched in the as per the job roles of the people who are going to access the information assets. Then third is the grouping and labeling of information resources. That is, you're talking about information assets. And based on the above three, that is inventory, classification of information resources, grouping and labeling of the information resources, you try to create an access control list. Now, this access control list, again, is defined in terms of mandatory controls, discretionary controls, rule-based control, role-based controls, things like that we have discussed earlier. Now, classification of information system resources asset is primarily done for identifying the resource owner or the data owners. Now, see, these are the words which I have been using it again and again. Now, resource owner, that means, or the data owner. That is, who is the person who is responsible for, that particular information asset, plays a very important role. Now, you will find definitely a question, mostly it is asked, one of the two questions are being asked on data owners. Now, automated password management tool works as a best preventive control and ensure compliance with the password management policy. Now, automated password management tool, if you are talking about, it's basically a preventive control. It will not be detecting it, but it will be preventing such type of playing around with the password, or tampering with the password management policy. It will prevent, in the sense that it will not allow people with a bad intention to have an access to a particular information assets. Now, when you say automated password management system, you must have seen that, when you log into a particular area, it says, password is required. When you type in a password, or you create a password, now these are these are the system generated passwords, right? Which are, and these system generated password management tools, which I'm talking about, these can be dynamic, that each time you log into it, and each time the system generates an automated password for that particular access to the information assets, which is again authorized only to the, based on who is the data owner. So data owner or the resource owner can have this privilege of automated password management tool. So this was the first part, which I have just completed, and I'm moving on to the next part, which is classification of information assets, right? Now, classification of information assets, when I'm talking about what are the benefit, it reduces the risk of underprotection of information assets and reduces the cost of overprotection of information assets. Now, first is that if you classify an information assets, now based on now, how do you classify the information assets? It's very important, it's urgent, it's confidential. The different ways we will be talking about it later. So depending upon the type of information assets, its urgency, its criticality, they need to be protected. So at times it happens that the information which is very critical, which is very sensitive, is normally not protected to the level that it should have been, and at the same time there are certain information which should not be that high guarded or that to be protected is overly protected. So when you try to classify the information assets, you are trying to clearly define that what type of a level of protection you're going to offer to those information assets. And the idea is that any information assets that require more security or more, which is more sensitive, need to be guarded and protected very well as compared to the information which requires less protection and maybe, it's easily available. So how do you do the classification of information assets? There are certain steps involved. You make an inventory of the information asset. Then based on that information asset inventory, you establish ownership for the information asset, who is responsible for what, because depending upon their job roles. Then classify information assets and the information system resources, label information assets and IS resources, create a access control list. These are the things which you have already done it. Then again, as I said, data owner and system owners, these are the people who are responsible for defining the access rule, because you will be responsible for the information asset which you are trying to maintain as a data owner or as a system owner. So you need to clearly be very careful about defining the access rule. That's who's going to access, up to what level a person is going to access. Now, to clearly understand the logical access control, it is essential that you must have worked in an environment, in an automated environment. You will find that up to a certain level you are being allowed, and after that, if you wanted to go further deeper into it, and if your job role does not allow, or your system owner or the data owner has not clearly allowed that anybody can access it, you will find that access restricted, you're not allowed to access that particular page. Something like that will happen, and you get a message on a screen which clearly says that access denied. A data owner and system owners, these are the people who are responsible for maintenance of proper security control over the information assets. So if a question is being asked that for information assets, if you're talking about who's responsible for maintenance of proper security controls over the information asset as far as logical access control is concerned, obviously the answer has to be the data owner if it is given the first. That's the reason I have used the word slash over here, and the second is the system owner. Now, well-defined data classification policy decreases the overall cost of control. Now, very clearly, if you under protection and over protection, I've already spoken about it. So if you clearly define, you have, if your data classification policy, or you can say that your policy of classifying your information assets is very clearly defined, it reduces the overall cost of control, right? Objective of data protection is basically, it's first is to ensure integrity and confidentiality of the data and establish appropriate access control guidelines. Now, integrity means that the data is not being tampered, and confidential, that means that the data has not been accessed by any person who is not authorized to access it. Now, data protection ensures that the data has not been tampered, that the data has not been manipulated. It is very confidential. It is only seen by the people who are responsible, who are answerable, or who has the right to see those, access those information asset. And for that, the organization or the system or the data owner has implemented proper access controls so that the data is well protected. Data classification must take into account, as we are talking about, the following requirements. First is the legal, contract, regulatory, and the contractual requirements. And the three important aspects which I have already talked about is confidentiality, integrity, and the availability, which means that in information environment or information system audit environment, we call it as CIA. The data classification, when you're talking about that, now when you're talking about data classification or when you're talking about defining the data protection, three things should come to your mind. First is that the data is, it takes into account that whosoever is trying to implement or talk about data protection must have three things in mind. The first important thing is confidentiality. That is, it should, when you are making the, when you are trying to protect the data, ensure that the data is only seen, or you implement access control in such a way that the data is only seen by the people who are authorized to see. Confidential. It cannot be seen by everyone. That is, there are certain filters which clearly defines that the level, or filters which defines who's going to access what type of information. Second is integrity is very important. That is, when the data, because we are talking about the digital assets, they travel over the network, they are accessed through network, they are accessed through the, open networks, closed networks, various devices. So that means when a data is traveling on a network which is open or closed, then it should ensure that the data is not being tampered or manipulated or changed during the process of transmission. And the last is, it should always also ensure that whenever there is need for the data, access need for the data, it should be made available. So with this, I think we have done a significant portion today, and I did right now in front of you logical access control. And we have spoken about the areas of classification of information. I said these are very important. Guys, let me tell you one thing, that the module 5th and module 6 are really, really important, because they talk about from the very, very, audit perspective. And let me make it one thing more clear to you, that why this course is not focused on making you to understand, various technical aspects. This course is meant for understanding what technology can do for the auditors, right? So we need to have a very broad conceptual clarity about the things, right? So that's the reason that what I did in my, when I appeared for the exam ESA, I found that there's so many things are there in the information which is published by our institute, but I need to filter it out what exactly is being required from the examination point of view. I hope you find this meaningful. With this, wait for my next videos on the remaining topics of module 5, dealing with protection of information assets. Thank you very much for watching. And I once again, I'm for the first time requesting, because I'm not a professional person who's on YouTube, I request you that if you like the videos, please do share and subscribe my channel. Thank you very much.